Darren. He has a question about the BLM. Darren, you're on the line with Senator Lee.
Hello, Darren.
Senator Lee, thank you for taking my call. This is Darren Bushman from Bayou County.
Hello, sir.
Hey, we have experienced a situation here with government agencies, specifically Forest Service and BLM, wherein they have rulemaking authority, rule enforcement authority, and they have appeal authority. And so our county's participated in the process up until objecting to new rules, and basically we're told, thanks but no thanks, we're going to do what we're going to do anyways. So we have all three branches of government residing within these federal agencies. How do we resolve that? I heard your conversation about the RAINS Act. The other side of that, we also have NGOs who are basically running these organizations, and for some reason they feel like they need to answer to them but not to the elected officials in the counties that are affected.
Okay, first of all, thank you for your call and thank you for your service as a commissioner. I appreciate all you do. Some of the very best governing that goes on in our country occurs at the local level, including and especially in our counties. So thank you for your work as a commissioner. I know that as a commissioner you deal with these issues constantly. You've raised an important issue, and one that was understood not only a few years ago, but was understood a few centuries ago. It was understood well by our founding fathers, and that's why they went out of their way to set up a system of government in which we would have three separate, distinct, coordinate branches of government. We'd have one branch of government, the legislative branch where I work, that would make the laws. Another branch of government, the executive branch, that would implement, execute, and enforce those laws. And a third branch, the judiciary, that would interpret those laws where their meaning came into conflict, where multiple parties couldn't agree as to their meaning. They acknowledged, moreover, that one of the worst things that can happen is when you have those powers fused into one person or into one body, here the BLM, as you're referring to it, where they effectively have the power to make law through their regulatory power, the power to enforce that same law, and they also purport to have the power to adjudicate questions with respect to that law. That is wrong. Now, the RAINS Act would cover a significant part of this problem, and it's one of the many reasons why we need the RAINS Act. But you know, on a different level, Commissioner, we also need reform of the way we handle and manage our federal public lands. I think one of the problems with the BLM right now is we simply own too much federal public land. The fact that we've got nearly 1/3 of the land mass under the ownership and exclusive control of the federal government, nearly 1/3 of the land mass in our country, and over 2/3 of the land mass in the state of Utah. That is too much power, too much control for any one agency to have. You know, you'd be really worried if any entity or any person within your county owned more than, say, 5 or 10% of the land in your county. I think you'd get even more worried if that person or that entity owned more like 20 or 30 or 40% of the land. And of course, your concern would grow that much more severe if that person or that entity owned 90% or more of the land in your county and declared itself to be a sovereign and not subject even to your taxing authority within the county, such that your county would be impoverished. Well, that's exactly what we've got going on. The federal government owns the overwhelming majority of the land in your county, I believe more than 90%. It therefore has stated that you can't tax that land, and it has said that you basically have to live with all of its judgments, all of its determinations. And that in turn makes it very difficult for the people in your county to do what they do best, to earn a living, to run their families, to run their farms, to run their ranches. That's a big problem. Now, there are people mostly east of the Mississippi who like to say, well, we all benefit from federal public land. There's some real truth to that, particularly when we're talking about things like our national parks. But what they don't realize is that in our state, nearly more than 2/3 of the land, nearly 70%, is under the ownership and control of the federal government. Most of that is not national park land. Most of that is just garden variety land that the federal government owns because it feels like owning it. And you know, I know there are benefits to having federal land owned by the public, but because those benefits are real, to the extent that they are real, the burdens associated with them, the corresponding burdens, the expense of maintaining the land, and the burdens that it puts on counties like yours are significant, and those burdens need to be shared. It's one of the reasons why I've introduced legislation that would entitle you as a county commissioner, would entitle other counties to make sure that you get a payment that's roughly equivalent to the property tax that would be paid by the federal government if this were private land. The federal government currently pays something called PILT, or payment in lieu of taxes, but it's often pennies on the dollar compared to what you would get if in fact this were privately owned land. But I believe they need to pay something that is the rough approximation of the actual property tax value. That's good for people in Utah, and it's also good for purposes of making federal officials aware of the true costs of owning this much land, and the fact that we put a disproportionate share of the burden on rural states like ours where there's a lot of federal public land. So look, there's a lot we can do in this area, but we've got to make other people more aware of it. As a member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, I'm working every single day to make my colleagues more aware of this burden that we share disproportionately in Utah. And I hope and expect that in time we'll be able to see some major change in our policies toward the federal ownership and control of public land.